and welcome back to my YouTube. I'm Nicole from Sleek-chic Interiors, and here you'll find styling videos, interior design advice and a few videos about leasehold, which leads me on to today's video. And it's probably one of my most read blogs on my website, and it is why I would never buy a leasehold property ever again. And if you've stumbled on this video because you are in the process of buying a leasehold property or you're about to exchange on a flat, please keep watching this video because I think it may open your eyes if you're not already aware about these issues in the current leasehold market. So let's get started. So firstly, what is a leasehold property? And I'm going to sum this up in the most simple way as possible. And a leasehold property is essentially a lease agreement between you and the landlord of the property. You don't own anything. You don't own the bricks, you don't own any outside land. It's essentially a lease agreement. It's just as good as having a rental property, but you've got a much larger investment in it. Leasehold properties are typically flats, but they can also be houses as well. It's not uncommon to find a leasehold house. So I'm going to share my personal story with you today about the leasehold property that I owned, the issues I encountered, and why it was possibly one of the worst and most stressful experiences of my life. And I'm hoping I can help some people in the process. So let's go back a few years. I was a first-time buyer. I didn't have a big enough salary to buy a house on my own, and living on my own, I actually didn't need a house anyway. I wanted a small flat, a nice location, and I just wanted to get onto the property ladder. I didn't want to be paying out dead rent each month, which I know a lot of people can relate to, and a lot of people will have to buy leasehold properties because it's all they can afford. And especially if you're looking in areas such as London, house prices are absolutely ridiculous, and a flat is pretty much the only way some people can get onto the property ladder. So anyway, I found a dream flat. It's honestly the first flat I view, absolutely fell in love with it, and it just felt a little bit too out of my price range. Anyway, the flat stayed on the market for a little while. For some reason, it just couldn't shift despite being an amazing location. So I put an offer in, I had it accepted, I'd met the landlord who'd redeveloped the property, and I was pretty much sold. I then waited 5 months, and I think this was, looking back in hindsight, was the time that I should have pulled out. There were a lot of red flags. Things taking a lot of time. The person who'd redeveloped the property had moved back from France. He wasn't aware of sort of English laws, and there was a lot of sort of ambiguity around the service charges, ground rent, and the lease agreement. And me being naive and young at the time, I didn't know anything about leasehold properties. I didn't go through the lease agreement with a fine-tooth comb, and I took everything at face value that the developer told me. And I pushed and pushed and pushed, and really I should have been kicking back and actually walking away from it. And that is one thing I want to share, that if something doesn't stack up, despite it being something you've fallen in love with, you have to walk away from it because it's going to save you so much stress and money, and there will be something else that will come along that's just as perfect. We're now fast forwarding sort of 3 years down the line, and the developer had done a runner. He had taken thousands and thousands of pounds off people for property mentorship that never existed, and it left his sort of business partner that didn't know anything about leasehold. So I will never forget the email she sent when we were querying service charges increase, and she said, you're lucky because wait until it's taken over by an official block management company. And yes, that was such a harrowing email because I remember referring back to that multiple times when all the service charges just kept increasing. So by this point, the leasehold has been sold to another landlord, but there's a bit of confusion because it's not just the landlord you're dealing with. The landlord deals with the ground rent. Firstly, what is ground rent? Your ground rent is normally a fee that is payable once a year to the landlord of the property. This doesn't go towards maintenance, buildings insurance, cleaning, anything like that. It's essentially a fee that you're paying for your flat to be kept on their land. It doesn't go to anything apart from the landlord's pocket. So the issue with ground rent that causes the biggest issues with selling and purchasing leasehold properties at the moment is the amount of it. So currently, as it stands in law, a ground rent over the value of £250 per year outside of London is considered an AST. An AST is an assured short hold tenancy. And in basic terms, this means that if the tenant or the owner of the flat was to default on their ground rent payments, it means that the landlord can take possession of the property more easily. So this basically means the mortgage lender loses their entire investment and there's nothing they can do about it. So we've talked about ground rent. Your next thing is your service charges. Service charges basically include anything that is required to service the building. It could be your cleaning, it could be repairs. If you've got a lift in the building, it might be the servicing that goes towards that, and it's everything and anything in between. In addition to your service charge, there can also sometimes be much bigger costs, and they will be processed on a Section 20 notice. But luckily I never had to encounter that personally myself. As well as the service charges, some landlords like to invoice buildings insurance as a separate matter, which in my flat they did as well. So suddenly you're talking about 3 different bills on top of your mortgage payments. When the landlord sold to the new landlord, things really started to become very, very difficult. We were still in sort of the COVID period when this transition happened. And all of a sudden we were being backdated for service charges for like the last 2 years. And there's honestly nothing more worrying than being sent a bill for about over £1,000 and saying it needs to be paid within 28 days. There's literally no negotiation. If you don't pay it, you could risk losing your leasehold property. When we received our first revised service charge bill, they had actually included a £3,000 communal electricity bill that was including an electric bill that was literally dating back 6 years that the developer had never paid for. All of the leaseholders knew that this was the issue and it wasn't ours to pay, yet the landlords didn't care, and they were like, in your lease it states you have to pay a communal bill, so we're just abiding by the lease. Anyway, I challenged the bill and I was continually ringing them and saying, I'm not paying for this until you have actually proved it. And it did take about 6 months, but it finally got to the point where they emailed and said, look, the bill's been written off, it's gone back to the old landlord's name, you don't need to pay it. And the worst part about that is they were happy for us to pay £3,000 and they genuinely did not care. So it is worth challenging these things if they are really unpredicted and it's not something that you have sort of seen before. Now, I've briefly touched on sort of ground rent and service charges. I actually want to talk about the process of selling a leasehold flat and why that was one of the worst experiences as well. By this point, I was desperate to get out of the flat. The service charges, the bills, the ground rent, the buildings insurance, it seemed like it was absolutely constant and there was no relenting of it. And it was adding considerable strain to my monthly outgoings, and it was just something I'd never accounted before. At this point, I was definitely paying more than our mortgage for 2-bed houses now. And it was just absolutely insane. I came across a lot of issues selling my leasehold flat. Firstly, don't expect to sell a flat or actually to purchase one within 2 months, like a typical house. It will take months, and for me, it took 9 months to sell my flat, and it was literally by the skin of my teeth. The first thing you need to produce is an LPE1 form, or it could also be known as a management pack. And this normally contains a series of important documents relating to your lease that have been provided legally by the freeholder or the managing agent, and it can include everything from service charges to ground rent, if there's any outstanding works that haven't been completed, and everything and anything that a new purchaser would need to know about the property. We had to pay for the agency fees to sell our flat. We've had to instruct a solicitor to sell the flat as well, and leasehold flats can typically be a little bit more expensive, and it can be harder to find solicitors that actually do leasehold sales. This is because they know how long it can take for a leasehold sale to go through, and a lot more work is required in the selling of a flat. The cost of LP1 forms does of course vary. Different landlords and different managing agents have completely different set of rules, so they can pretty much charge whatever they like, and if you don't want to pay it, you're not getting it, essentially. So for 2 A4 sheets of paper, it cost me a total of £840 for the LPE1 management pack to be completed. Initially, I had to pay £240 to the managing agents. This is who the landlord has instructed to essentially manage the property. So they don't own the property, but they manage it. So it cost me £240 for them, and that was an issue that I thought was completed. I thought they did it. It was then 2 weeks before my property was to be completed that I was told that actually the freeholder or the landlord needed to complete 2 questions that hadn't already been done. For those 2 remaining questions, it cost me £600. There is no negotiation, there is no challenging of costs. That is what you pay, and as they always state, this is what the costs have always been. By this point in the process, I'd already had to pay for lots of other additional things along the way, and I was literally spending hundreds and hundreds of pounds like they were pennies. I just wanted to get this sale through the line by this point. But an LPE1 form is a really important thing to mention, because when you purchase a property, you actually rarely think about selling it. But when you are purchasing a leasehold property, you do need to be aware that there are going to be these extra expenses when you do come to selling it. And it's something I had no knowledge about. No one had ever told me that this was something I'd have to do. There were lots and lots of twists and turns during selling my property. There'd already been a huge issue that had come up to do with flooring. That was a discrepancy in the lease, and I had to pay for a £70 indemnity policy to resolve that issue. But things got a lot worse. Up to this point, there had been absolutely no mention about ground rent, it being a high charge, or there being any issue whatsoever to do with it. There was about 2 weeks to go at which point I thought the sale of the property was about to go through, when they said that basically, if I didn't do a deed of variation to the existing lease, the purchaser's lenders would not lend and the sale would collapse. And this was all because the ground rent was £250. And as I'd already stated earlier in the video, this is when it becomes something called an AST. To this point, I had never ever heard about issues with ground rent or onerous levels of ground rent. No one had mentioned it to me. I was like, when did this issue actually become a thing? And the answer is that it hasn't always been an issue, but at least for the last few years it has been. And the only reason I didn't know anything about it is because no one else in the property had sold before, and I wasn't in the Leasehold group on Facebook, and I didn't know anyone else that had sold a leasehold property, so how on earth would I have known it was an issue? But of course that evening I spent a lot of time Googling, and I felt sick to my stomach. I genuinely thought I'd never get out of this flat, but the worst part hadn't happened yet. I hadn't actually found out what a deed of variation was, and I didn't realise the costs that would be implicated in the process. At this point of time, I thought a deed of variation was going to be the only way I was going to get around this £250 ground rent issue, and I was dogged in getting this sorted. The following morning, I rang the landlord, and I basically said, need a deed of variation, like how much is it going to cost and how soon can it be done? A deed of variation is essentially making an amendment to your existing lease. You can do a deed of variation for lots of different things, but this one in particular was to do with the ground rent, and it would be that they would cap the ground rent at £250, which would satisfy the mortgage lender, and it would also protect the purchaser from rising ground rent in the future. And another thing to note is my ground rent was linked to RPI. So ground rent typically is linked to a rise in RPI over a certain amount of years. It could be a doubling ground rent clause, which is one of the worst, or it could be that it increases by a set amount every sort of 10 years. But generally speaking, rising RPI and doubling ground rent are two of the most common terms in a lease. So it's really important to check those out if you are in the process of purchasing, because it can make a really big difference. So the freeholder came back to me about the deed of variation in this instance to cap the ground rent at £250. Firstly, they said it was possible, which was great. But secondly, they said there was going to be an initial inquiry that's going to cost £1,800 plus VAT. This would include them doing the legal work for it, getting someone to obtain the lease and going through it, and then coming back to me with the costs. Little did I know, that is not the end of it. So at this point, I would have to pay £1,800 without knowing what the actual premium is going to be. Premium is basically worked out on the amount of ground rent that the landlord is going to be missing out on over the X period of years left on your lease. So in this respect, the landlord couldn't give me a direct answer, but obviously I don't want to spend £1,800 without knowing what the premium is going to be at this stage. So when he came back, I instantly was like, I think I just went into shock. He was like, it's going to be 14 to 15K for the premium. And at that point, I genuinely thought I am going to be stuck here for the rest of my life. There is no way I can afford that. So obviously I get that back and I'm like, I'm not paying that. There's no way I can do it. What are my solutions? What else can I do? So my solicitor at this stage, I was super angry with them that they'd never told me about this issue before. And I'd done some research online, but there was really very little information about what other solutions there were to getting around this ground rent issue. And in fact, how do you sell a flat with ground rent over £250? So they basically came back and they said, we can try an indemnity policy. So if the indemnity policy wasn't to work, we would have to relist the property to the market and just try and attract cash buyers where the issue wouldn't be so much of a thing as the mortgage lenders wouldn't be involved. So the indemnity policy was requested and it would have been around £50 if the mortgage lender accepted it. I'd read so many articles online that were basically like, some accept it, some don't, and I had to wait for 2 weeks to find out whether the lender accepted the indemnity policy. And I was pretty much sort of like 50-50. I had no idea it was going to go through. And I now still remember the day that I had the phone call and said they've accepted it. And I genuinely never felt so much relief in my entire life. It was just, I just cannot tell you the relief. I can even feel it now. Like, it was the difference between paying £50 to 15K, and it just made so much difference. I've got to say that the leasehold property experience has been absolutely horrendous, and I dread to think how much I spent over the entire period of it. And definitely in selling the flat, it, as well as other issues I might not have mentioned on this video today, it probably set me back around 5 to 6 grand to actually sell the property. And you just never come across that with selling a house unless you had issues to sort of rectify. But for me, if I could sum up the main reasons why I would never buy leasehold again, the first one is you don't own the property. You literally do not own a single brick. Often when you live in a flat, you share the property with other people in flats, and most of the time that's great if it's residential, but for me a lot of the other properties were Airbnb flats and it felt like it was never my home. There were different people coming all the time, even during sort of the COVID period. So that was another thing. People were slamming doors constantly. I was constantly hearing kids running across the stairs over the top, but I felt like a renter that had invested a lot of money to actually be there and to continue paying to be there. The scariest thing is you've got no control over service charges. In the future, there is a leasehold reform that hopes to sort of cap ground rent or bring it back to a peppercorn. And what peppercorn basically means is that it reduces it to a nominal value, such as £1. And I do have hope for leasehold in the future that this might happen, but at the moment it's just a complete issue for so many people that have flats and are unable to move on from selling them. I was lucky because I was able to get an indemnity policy that protected me from the 250 ground rent, but this was a year ago now, and I already know that lots of things have changed since then, and it's becoming even harder for people to sell. And especially in this current market, ground rent linked to RPI increases has almost become worse than doubling ground rent. So things are constantly changing, and it's really important to keep abreast of that as well to protect yourself. And of course, service charges. Your lease will outline service charges to a certain extent, but landlords are uncapped. They can charge whatever they like. No one in the media is currently talking about increasing service charges. And the worst part is, unlike electricity bills or gas bills, there is no one helping people with rising service charges, and leaseholders have no option but to pay them. I know so many people that have become in debt by owning a flat, and it's honestly just the most heartbreaking thing. The worst thing is that when young people or older people buy flats for their first property, we often think it's the cheapest route. And yes, on paper, flats are generally still cheaper in value. There's no discovery and there is no explanation of all these hidden costs that you could come across in the future. And it suddenly becomes an unrealistic, unaffordable housing solution that you once thought was the answer. And I really feel for people that have to buy a leasehold property, because there is no way that they can afford a house, especially people that are within London, and it's a really difficult situation. I have written loads of blog posts about leasehold, everything from ground rent to service charges, how to get service charge refunds, and of course, how to sell a flat with ground rent over £250. And I get a lot of comments from people that are in a similar position, or they're purchasing a leasehold property and they're looking for advice on whether they should go ahead with the purchase. And I'm always happy to respond to people, because I just hate the fact that there is so many people going through these issues right now and solicitors aren't helping and they aren't instructing. The reason I share these videos and why I share these blog posts is because there was nothing out there when I was selling my flat, and also when I was purchasing a flat, about the issues to look for. And perhaps I would have not purchased the flat and saved a little bit longer for a house, knowing that when I did buy it, it was going to be mine solely and fully. If you are seriously considering buying a leasehold property, please check all the facts before you do so. When you do get provided that lease from the solicitors, you want to read it like a fine tooth comb, and if there is anything in it that's a little bit out of the ordinary, absolutely challenge it. I'm going to end this video by saying this is my personal experience with having a leasehold property and also selling it. And I do know that there are lots of leasehold properties out there that are absolutely fine. They have minimal ground rent fees. The leasehold is managed by the leaseholders. Are obviously variables to owning a leasehold flat. I've popped a number of links in the comments below for blogs surrounding leasehold that you might find interesting. And if you do have any comments, or if you've got any experiences you'd like to share, I'd love to hear them in the comments below. My name's Nicole, I'm from Sleek-chic Interiors, and I'll be sharing more videos over the coming months. So do press the subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.